With a U.S. aircraft carrier already positioned near Iran and another on the way, President Trump isn't just negotiating from strength. He's negotiating with a loaded gun on the table. And when he says regime change would be the best thing that could happen, the real question isn't whether Tehran is listening, it's whether the decision has already been made. Jerusalem Minute starts now. Welcome back to Jerusalem Minute here on JNS TV. Josh Haston here, correspondent for JNS News, alongside CEO of JNS, Alex Drayman. Alex, you are back in Israel after a whirlwind trip to Washington, D.C. to cover the seventh meeting between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Donald Trump. It was pretty unique. I mean, sitting here waiting for a press conference, some big announcement, something that happened. This did not happen. Alex, talk about your trip.
Well, you were waiting for that. We were also waiting. It was a unique trip in the fact that first, the trip was scheduled to take place this coming week, and then it was moved up quickly, where it seemed as though Netanyahu was racing into Washington as it became more and more clear that the president was serious about engaging in a negotiation with Iran. And usually on these trips, you get a little presser before the prime minister goes on the plane. He said a few sentences, but then when you get into Washington, most often there is a photo opportunity when the prime minister comes into the White House. Usually he'd be greeted by the president at the door of the West Wing. That didn't happen. The prime minister went around to the south side of the White House while the media was sitting waiting at the West Wing. Oftentimes there would be a press conference scheduled for after the meeting. And even if there wasn't a previously scheduled press conference after the meeting, lots of times the president of the United States, who does appreciate speaking to the press, will invite press to come in. And none of that happened. For the entirety of the 36 hours that we were on the ground, we did not see the prime minister. We did not see the president of the United States until the prime minister arrived at Andrews Air Force Base to get back onto the plane. And there he gave some remarks, but we didn't see the president or the prime minister at all on the ground during the trip.
I want to ask you why, but first let's check out that clip of Netanyahu's comments getting back on the plane after his trip to D.C.
אני סיימתי עכשיו ביקור קצר אבל חשוב בוושינגטון, בשיחה עם ידידנו הגדול הנשיא טראמפ. יש בינינו קשר מאוד הדוק ומאוד אמיתי ומאוד גלוי. כמובן השיחות התמקדו בכמה וכמה נושאים, אבל למעשה במשא ומתן עם איראן. הנשיא חושב שהאיראנים כבר למדו אם יש להם עסק. הוא חושב שהתנאים שהוא יוצר בשילוב העובדה שהם בוודאי מבינים שהם טעו בפעם הקודמת שהם לא עשו הסכם, שיכול להיות שיווצרו התנאים להשגת הסכם טוב. רוצה לשמוע את דעתי. אני לא אסתיר מכם שאני הבעתי סקפטיות כללית לגבי טיב הסכם כלשהו עם איראן, אבל אמרתי שאם אכן יושג הסכם, אז הוא חייב לכלול את האלמנטים שהם חשובים מאוד מבחינתנו, מבחינת ישראל, לדעתי לא רק ישראל, זאת אומרת זה לא רק הגרעין, זה גם הטילים הבליסטיים, זה גם השלוחים האיראנים.
So Alex, there you have the Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Explain why that is. Seventh trip, no comments made to the press. What is going on here?
Well, I think there's actually a parallel between the prime minister going to Washington now as the president of the United States about to enter into a negotiation with Iran and when the prime minister went to Congress in 2015 to oppose President Obama's entering into the JCPOA, the original Iran nuclear deal. A lot of parallels, but also a lot of differences. Prime Minister Netanyahu is opposed to any deal being struck with the Iranian regime. He doesn't believe that a deal with the Iranian regime over their nuclear program is worth the paper it's printed on. And we have every reason to believe that it's not worth the paper it's printed on. The Iranians are signatories to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and that didn't stop them from developing nuclear weapons. They hide all their progress from the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and then they signed together with Obama the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and we know that they continued to develop illicit nuclear weapons on the side when they were by their own signature prevented from doing so. But here, what you see the difference is that the president of the United States considered it a major affront when Netanyahu came in to speak to Congress in 2015. Obama was livid that Netanyahu would come in to oppose the Iran nuclear deal, even though that deal had existential impact on Israel's security. And here, President Trump, the president of the United States, he says, yes, we are going to try to get into negotiation. We would prefer, for many reasons, a negotiation with Iran over a military intervention. But I want to hear what you have to say. I want to see your intelligence. I want to know if you believe that Iran is continuing to develop nuclear weapons. I want to know what you say about Iran continuing to build out their ballistic program, which Israel considers to be another existential threat aside from the nuclear threat. And we want to know what intelligence you have about Iran gunning down its own civilians in the streets protesting the regime. And I think that this president has always wanted to hear the prime minister's views on what's going on. And you see, and we've seen this several times already, that there are different camps within the Trump administration. On the one hand, we've talked about it, you have Trump himself. You have Marco Rubio, who's the Secretary of State. You have Pete Hegseth, Secretary of War or Secretary of Defense, all kind of aligned together with U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, all aligned on exactly on how things should work and the relationship between Israel and the United States and Iran and the other terror proxies in the region. Then on the other side, you have Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, who are out leading these negotiations. They were the ones leading the negotiations with Hamas in Gaza. They go off and they're leading negotiations with Russia and Ukraine. Now they're leading the negotiations with the Iranians. And the president does trust them, but he also wants to know if the information that they're bringing back to him, if that jives, if that lines up with the information that Prime Minister Netanyahu and his administration are bringing. So the president wanting to know exactly how the prime minister feels about it. And I think that the prime minister was very clear about what the terms of a deal would be, what they would need to be. Even though he says in that clip, as you saw, that he's expressing his general skepticism that any deal with Iran could be reached. I think what was important for Netanyahu also is to understand, okay, what's your timeline here? Okay, you're going to try to engage with these guys. They're not likely to sign a deal. So what is that timeline? What's it going to look like? And what happens if the negotiations with Iran fail?
So, Alex, you have, at the same time as the second round of negotiations, looks like they might take place, I heard, in Switzerland, perhaps this week, between the Americans and Iran. I just saw that several minutes ago here on Israeli television. The 2026 JNS International Policy Summit is coming up April 15th through the 17th at the Waldorf Astoria in Jerusalem. It's shaping up to be a phenomenal few days, and we'd love for you to join us. Visit jns-summit.org to register and take a look at the speaker lineup. It's a top-level group. Hope to meet you in Jerusalem this April. You have the USS Gerald Ford, which is the biggest aircraft carrier in the world, making its way to the region. And one of the figures you didn't mention was J.D. Vance, because he was also asked in the midst of these talks between Netanyahu and Trump about the regime in Iran. And he said that he preferred if the Iranian people overthrow the regime themselves. That being said, over the weekend, President Trump essentially called for a regime change in Iran. Let's check out that clip.
Offers regime change in Iran? Well, it seems like that would be the best thing that could happen. For 47 years, they've been talking and talking and talking. In the meantime, we've lost a lot of lives while they talk, and legs blown off, arms blown off, faces blown off. Tremendous power has arrived, and additional power, as you know, another carrier is going out shortly. So we'll see it out. If we could get it settled for once and for all, that'd be good. What do you want it for? What? Would you want to take over? I don't want to talk about that. There are people.
So, Alex, which one is it? Is it the people of Iran needing to overthrow the regime? Is it the United States backing them? What's going to happen here? You have Vance on one side, and then it looks like Trump is perhaps aligning himself towards the camp of Hegseth and Rubio and that side of the spectrum.
Well, I think that Vance is not wrong, that any regime change should be because the Iranian people want to overthrow the regime. That's an important reason. As far as Israel's concerned, this regime has got to go.
Right.
That's for sure. But the president of the United States doesn't want to be seen as taking out a regime because the prime minister of the state of Israel says to the president of the United States, hey, I need you to take out Khamenei because we got to get this guy out of here. So the protests have been very useful inside Iran because they demonstrate to the international community as well as to American citizens that it is the Iranians themselves also that want this regime out. Now, what we've been seeing over the last month or two is that the Iranian people do not have the firepower to affect the regime change when the Islamic Republic, under Ayatollah Khamenei, also has the Basij, have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that are basically there to maintain their power over the Iranian public. So you see that the president, on the one hand, I think he does want to help the protesters, and he said it a few times. There's these famous tweets. I don't know if we could show them on screen, where he said, we're locked and loaded. He told the protesters to go out and protest. He said, help is on the way. And He knows that he said those things, okay? And people have challenged him on that. And I think that might have been, I can't know this, but that might have been a reason why the president opted not to take questions at the White House when usually he does. Mm-hmm. I mean, Netanyahu never wants questions at the White House, but Trump usually allows it. I think perhaps Trump didn't want to face questions on what did you mean when you say help is on the way? Why did you tell the protesters to go out there and protest if you were not, quote unquote, locked and loaded? And we also do see that the president has sent what he called a beautiful armada, a massive armada, and they're sending the Ford, and the Lincoln is already there. And we see how much firepower is being sent. I think that the president does understand the leverage that the United States carries. He understands the weakness of the Iranian regime right now. And I think that he, as a master negotiator, right, this is the author of The Art of the Deal, wants to know if he can get the negotiated deal that he wants. And I actually think that part of the negotiated deal that he wants is a regime change. Right. He may be turning around to this regime and saying, hey, there's going to be a regime change. You guys are out. Okay, that is for sure. Okay, and now the question is, well, how are you going to go out? Do you want to go out because we're going to send B-2 bombers and drop bunker busting MOP bombs on your face? Or are you going to take an exit ramp out like the way I offered to Maduro in Caracas? He refused to take it and he ended up in a jail in New York City. Or are you going to take the exit ramp that was given to Bashar Assad, where he got on a plane and he went to Moscow? So those are your choices, right? And then he may get the negotiated settlement. If negotiated settlement means no nuclear weapons, it means destruction of the ballistic missiles, if it means no shooting protesters, and you guys are out, I think that's a deal that the president might go for. And as the this best negotiator in capitalism, he wants to see if he can get the deal using maximum American leverage. If not, then I think that there's the possibility of a U.S. and potentially joint Israeli military strike. At the same time, I think it is important to note that the prime minister of the state of Israel, Netanyahu, also has leverage. He may well be saying to the president of the United States, and he has intimated as much, that he's not going to necessarily be bound by an American negotiation with Iran. He might say, hey, President of the United States, you're signing a deal with those guys. That's between you and them. We're not party to your agreement. And if we see that Iran poses an existential threat to us once again, that we will strike if we feel it is in our existential national security interests. So that leverage that Netanyahu has also may be weighing heavily on Trump's decisions as to whether to enter into negotiation and what happens if those negotiations break down.
So again, going back to that meeting, we did not have a press statement or whatnot, but President Trump still going on TV, talking to the cameras since the meeting with Netanyahu. And just several nights ago, Trump, once again, I think he said it once in the Knesset when the president was here, speaking here last Sukkot upon the hostage releases, in terms of insisting that Prime Minister Netanyahu get a pardon for President Isaac Herzog, calling Bibi an amazing prime minister, a great wartime prime minister, and turning, I guess, directly to Herzog, not for the first time, and telling him, enough already, Prime Minister Netanyahu deserves a pardon. Let's check out this video.
I can tell you he's been a very good wartime prime minister. He's been very strong. We've worked with him very well. We had tremendous success with Iran and everything else we've done. And he really has been. He's been, extraordinary as far as a wartime prime minister. Not easy. And, you have a president that refuses to give him a pardon. I think that man should be ashamed of himself. A pardon over this trial that's going on. The president of Israel, the primary power he's got is the power to give pardons. And he's not, he said he's given it 5 different times, but he doesn't want to do it because I guess he loses his power. I think the people of Israel should really shame him. He's disgraceful for not giving it. He should give it.
So there you have it. And from what I understand, perhaps directly as a result of Trump's comments, President Herzog saying Thursday night that Netanyahu's request for a pardon remains under legal review. And we'll have to see how it plays out here. But here you have President Trump again going to bat for Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Well, seems like it's more than going to bat. First, he turned to Herzog famously when he was at the Knesset. Trump was dressed at the Knesset. He turned to Herzog. He said, hey, why don't you pardon this guy? He deserves a pardon. And then later he sent a letter to Herzog saying, that this is a great wartime prime minister and he deserves a pardon. But now he's taken it to another level. He basically said here, you saw that it said that Herzog should be ashamed of himself. He said that Israelis should be ashamed of their president. Said that the one power that Herzog has, one of the few powers that he has, is to pardon people. And he's refusing to use the power that he has to pardon Netanyahu. I mean, it's definitely an affront to Herzog. You're hearing all the opponents of Netanyahu saying that this is an affront to the sovereignty of the state of Israel to make its own decisions. But the president believes, I think you can see very strongly, that the prime minister of Israel needs to be pardoned because he should not have to ask the court if he can fly to the United States to take a meeting with President Trump because the court decides that he has to testify that week in cases that have just been dragging out over 5 years and have been falling apart piece by piece by piece by piece, proving themselves to be a charade of law as opposed to an upholding of law. And perhaps the president did so because the opposition in Israel may be trying to send signals to the Israeli public and the international community that Netanyahu failed in his meeting when he went to Washington. Because usually what you see is, these two leaders smiling, shaking hands, saying that the two regimes, the two administrations are lockstep on how to deal with issues. But here you see now that there might be some difference of opinion on how to deal with Iran. And so instead of letting the Israeli press try to project all of a sudden some kind of rift, what you see is that the president of the United States saying, no, there's not a rift over here. Okay? Like Netanyahu has been a great wartime prime minister and he deserves to be pardoned. And so that basically so that the two of them can continue to work together. And I did have, one Israeli official, tell me in background, he said, there's this board of peace, and I think we'll talk about that in a minute, but what you see is that you also have a board of war. And the two commissioners on the board of war are President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so the two of them need to meet face to face. They need to discuss what the next stages will be in this war, which I think we're seeing now that this war, as much as we want it to be over, as much as we didn't want it to start to begin with, it's not over. There's war to be fought in Gaza. There's potentially more war to be fought in southern Lebanon. And it looks like there will be war again in Iran soon. And what I think was particularly interesting is that while the president did not make any statements while Netanyahu was there, what we did see were those clips the day after or 2 days after the meeting where the president has said, I do have a deadline in my mind of how long that should be, how long this negotiation process should take place. And he even went as far as to say, I think it would be about a month.
Well, obviously, we'll see what happens, and we'll be the first to know here in Israel in terms of what goes on there. But that brings us, as you mentioned, to the Board of Peace, the meeting, I believe, scheduled for the 19th. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, from what I understand at this juncture, will not be flying back. I believe Gideon Sa'ar will be representing the state of Israel. And if you saw the tweet there on X, the Board of Peace welcomes Israel as a founding member of our growing international organization. So it is official. Reports indicate that when the Peace Council meets, This coming week, Trump will announce a funding plan worth billions of dollars for the rebuilding of the Gaza Strip, and will also present a list of countries that will send troops in order to ensure that, as he has said many times, Hamas must be demilitarized in this phase two.
Well, this was certainly the second most important topic, most urgent topic being discussed. And the prime minister did sign in a separate meeting that he had with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, a letter affirming Israel's participation in the Board of Peace and basically committing Israel to the Board of Peace, and also signing a separate letter committing that Netanyahu's signature is all the approval that's needed. So there wasn't anything that needed to be taken to the cabinet or taken to the Knesset on this. Netanyahu signed a paper and basically committed Israel to the Board of Peace. And for other countries, right, there's not so much high stakes on that because the Board of Peace is not dealing with those countries as principles of what the Board of Peace is going to be working on. Here, Israel is one of the principles because the Board of Peace was specifically designed initially, and not exclusively, but initially to deal with concluding this conflict between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. And as you mentioned, this coming week, they're about to be announcing this major aid package to the Gazans in the Gaza Strip. And I think Netanyahu's got to be asking, what are the conditions under which this aid can start to flow into Gaza? Hamas is still running around. The estimates are that they have anywhere from 50 to 60,000 machine guns that they're running around with. They have committed, basically, essentially, that they're not going to disarm. They still remain in control over much of the Gaza Strip. They're terrorizing the population there. And the ceasefire plan, the 20-point plan that was signed, commits Hamas to disarming and commits the Gaza Strip to being demilitarized. And so the question is now, what are the conditions under which aid flows? And then the second part of it is, if this international stabilization force is going to be deployed, and we've read reports that Indonesia, for example, might be sending 8,000 troops into Gaza. Well, what mandate are they going to have? Are they going to be fighting against the Hamas terrorists that are hiding among the civilian population? Are they going to be willing to risk their lives to fight Hamas? Chances are not. That the international stabilization force only has a role to play after Hamas has been demilitarized. And if they go in first, then the fear is for Israel, as has happened numerous times, like with UNIFIL in southern Lebanon, that UN peacekeeping agency that went into southern Lebanon to keep the peace between Israel and Hezbollah back in 2006, that the International Stabilization Force is essentially going to provide cover for Hamas, as UNIFIL provided cover for Hezbollah, and that they're actually going to prevent Israel from taking out Hamas. So you would think that if Israel intends or understands that the only force that can disarm and demilitarize Hamas is the IDF, that they're not going to want the International Stabilization Force deployed until after that operation. So these are the different things that I believe that Netanyahu and Trump spoke about. Their meeting took over 3 hours. The meeting was scheduled for an hour and a half, but you see that there are a lot of existential issues on the agenda for that meeting.
Yeah, I would agree, Alex. I think foreign troops is an absolute mistake. I mean, Israel has to defend itself with our army. We've said it in other conflicts, and time again, has to be IDF soldiers. And in terms of the disarming Hamas, we keep talking about that, and that's part of phase two. But nevertheless, according to this, and I take it with a grain of salt because it is a New York Times report indicating that Hamas perhaps will surrender some of their weapons or whatnot. But that being said, according to this report, the group will be allowed to keep at least initially some small arms. So again, you say demilitarized and whatnot, yet according to the report, even Witkoff, Kushner and whatnot will allow them, at least in the beginning, to have small arms. I mean, so that's not really demilitarized.
And the big question when you see reports like this is, who is the source leaking this information to the New York Times, right? And so oftentimes we see that these could be mid-level bureaucrats that hate Israel, that are, just trying to put things out there, in order to create misdirection. But there's also been unsourced reports suggesting that some of these unsourced reports might be coming from Witkoff or Kushner themselves, that they and their staff are the ones that are leaking some of this information to the press. And of course, if the report that Kushner and Witkoff believe that Hamas should be able to keep small arms. If that's true, that would also explain why Netanyahu needs to rush in, because he's saying, no, there's a deal. We signed the deal. Obviously, Israel signed that deal because they wanted the hostages back, and they were willing to withdraw from half of the Gaza Strip and pause fighting in order to get the hostages back, because obviously fighting a war is going to be easier from the psychological level and from many other reasons if there's no more hostages in place. And the prime minister prioritized getting the hostages back, and he believed that the chances of getting all the hostages back were much greater only through a signed agreement. So he signed that agreement, but those 20 points, you better understand that 17, 18 of those points are the points that Israel wanted in there, including that Hamas will be disarmed. And if Hamas can keep the small arms, well, that's the majority of the arms that they have. And even if you go back to October 7th, Hamas did not attack Israel with nuclear weapons or chemical weapons on October 7th. They attacked Israel with small arms, right? They carried out that entire massacre using what would be defined here as small arms. So Israel does not want to see any small arms remaining in the hands of Hamas, at any point. And the idea that the Board of Peace or the United States would permit that would be reason enough for Netanyahu to fly to Washington to talk to Trump face to face.
Now, I think we talk about this almost every week, but I think it's really important for people out there to understand that Israel's still at war in Gaza. We still have IDF troops who are deployed in Gaza. I believe last week you said it was 53%. The IDF controls in Gaza. And you still have incidents, I just saw one last night, of terrorists emerging from a tunnel inside Gaza, making their way towards IDF positions. And last night, I think 2 terrorists were taken out. Also this week, a Hamas terrorist behind a deadly 2004 double suicide bombing. I believe that was in Beersheba. He was taken out by the IDF in a precise strike. So this is happening every single day per the ceasefire, because these people are going out trying to attack Israeli soldiers. They pose a threat to the Israeli people. So Israel has to do what it has to do, take out the bad guys.
I think the strategic question here is, can this status quo, where Israel does operate day after day after day to destroy tunnels on the one and to find and destroy terrorists who are either posing themselves as a threat to Israel or are attacking actively against Israeli troops, if that's the way, where you don't have a massive operation, but Israel continues to just slowly take out the next terrorist and the next terrorist and the next tunnel? Or do we need to see some kind of renewed operation? And if there is a renewed operation, what that would mean is the significant call-up of troops. You would see again Hamas using the Gazan civilians as human shields. So they would do everything in their power to try to increase the number of civilian casualties, collateral damage, so to speak, because then you would get, once again, this pressure in the international media, in governments around the world, in the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, UN, Security Council resolutions, is putting more and more and more pressure on Israel. And I think Israel appreciates right now that with the signing of the ceasefire, that you don't hear too much conversation right now about what's going on in Gaza, whether that's because of the situation in Iran, whether that's because of what ICE agents are doing in Minnesota or elsewhere, or whatever the other stories are. Israel has come down the ranking of the order of stories in the New York Times and elsewhere. For Israel, that's very good. So I think for Israel, they might not want everything that comes along with a renewed operation. They might prefer this, strategic, just, whack-a-mole strategy. Every time a terrorist comes up, you just whack them down, as opposed to the massive call-up. But at the same time, Prime Minister Netanyahu also did declare many times that there would be total victory in Gaza. And he's also going into an election season. So he may want to have that total victory concluded. And total victory includes making sure that Hamas is completely disarmed, no longer poses a threat to Israel, and also the cutting off of this head of the terror octopus in Iran. And you believe that the prime minister would want all of this concluded prior to the elections, which are scheduled for October of this coming year. So the truth is that that doesn't leave a lot of time. And that also explains why the prime minister might be rushing to the White House to say, hey, let's not give these negotiations with Iran another month or 2 months. Like, we know the Iranians are going to try to drag it out as long as possible. For them, negotiations are a stalling tactic. So if Netanyahu feels like he's on the clock, he wants to get this done and over with as soon as possible. So he also doesn't want to see Iran and Trump, playing out the clock on this.
Politics always playing a part, whether we like it or not. I mean, that's the reality of it.
And for Trump, it also plays.
For sure, midterms are coming up.
Right, and domestically, you have a lot of Americans that don't want to see the United States being caught up in a military entanglement in the Middle East. And they also look at what Trump has done in Venezuela, just taking out Maduro, and they see that Cuba could fall in the next month or two. So you see that Trump could very quickly get a reputation for just affecting regime change all over the place, and Trump doesn't want that either. And that's why you have Vance coming out and saying, it's better if the Iranian people do it, because it is better from Trump's domestic perspective if he's not the one that is seen removing regimes one after the other around the world. So yes, Israeli politics plays a role in this. American politics plays a role in it, and perhaps it shouldn't, but that's just the reality.
Alex, let's talk about Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur to the PA, to the Palestinians. Several European countries and the UN chief, Antonio Guterres, distancing themselves from Albanese. She made horrible comments, anti-Jewish, anti-Israel comments, saying that Israel was the common enemy of humanity. So now, after all this time, the UN chief, countries including Germany, France, Austria, and Italy, saying they don't agree with her positions when it comes to Israel.
Well, tell us how you really feel, Francesca Albanese. She has been the head of the propaganda arm of Hamas this entire war. And it's not just Al Jazeera, getting Qatari funding. She is the repertoire for the Palestinian territories at the United Nations. And she has been spewing every narrative that Israel's been committing war crimes, that Israel is an occupier, that Israel is a colonizer, that Israel is committing genocide, that Israel is using famine as a policy of war. She does this freely, and the statements that she makes, they are picked up by the International Criminal Court, by the International Court of Justice. Al Jazeera, has her on as a regular star. I was at a conference recently on Hungary and European-Israel relations, and I put on Al Jazeera just to see what was going on that day, because you put on the TV, and the only channel that's going to give you any coverage of what's going on in Israel and with Gaza is Al Jazeera. So, I put it on. I wanted to see what the coverage looks like. They had Francesca Albanese on for more than half an hour straight on a Zoom on Al Jazeera, just bashing Israel with every propaganda lie in the book. And I think that the question here is, what took all these countries so long to finally stand up and say that they disagree with the things that she's saying? And then the question is, well, why did they finally do it? If they've been allowing her to say what she's been spewing for so long, did she cross the line here by saying that Israel is the enemy of all of common humanity? I mean, yes, that is a line, but it would have seemed to me that she crossed these lines long ago. But glad to see finally the Czech Republic, France, others, Austria, other countries standing up and saying that this lady and what she's been doing is out of bounds. And you even now have the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, backing away from some of the statements that she's making. But the next question is she going to be dismissed from her post?
At the same time, Alex, these useful idiots in Hollywood penned a letter this week to support Albanese. I think Mark Ruffalo and a bunch of the others who've been bashing Israel for years, they support the things that she's saying.
Yeah, I mean, and if you want to understand why so many people around the world are, siding with this virulently Israel positions because you have people like Albanese sitting at the United Nations. It's because you have anti-Semites like Karim Khan, the lead prosecutor in the International Criminal Court. It's because Al Jazeera has been part of the strategy that Qatar figured out to support the Hamas, Gazan, Palestinian, Arab cause. All of it is designed to isolate Israel diplomatically. The prime minister talks about this diplomatic war as the eighth front, but in many ways it's the first front because it is the front in which Israel until now does not have an answer. They have never known how to defeat the Albaneses of the world. Perhaps now we're going to see some turning of the tide as countries begin to pull away from the words that she's been spewing.
Let's see if they have the guts to fire this Jew hater. It's way, way past due. And Alex, we're almost out of time, but let's get to the final topic today, the holiday of Ramadan, the month-long period of reflection, peace, charity, and fasting in the Islamic world and the Muslim world begins this Thursday, February the 19th. There's a whole to-do in terms of deciding when Ramadan starts based on the lunar calendar. But unfortunately, this time of peace and reflection in Israel, as we know over the years, has become a time of terrorism. Ironically, but very, very sadly, the Israeli security forces on high alert. And this year is no different. We are on high alert as Ramadan approaches.
Well, is it ironic? Ramadan has consistently been tied to increases in terrorism throughout Israel, and perhaps that's because people are fasting during the day and maybe they're getting hangry, so to speak, because they're not eating, especially when Ramadan coincides with the summer and the fast is longer. Now, maybe it's a little bit easier because Ramadan is not in the hot summer months and the sundown comes a little bit earlier. But it also might be because the Arabs here will spend more time in the mosques. And when they spend more time in the mosque, they get the incitement that comes through the mosques. So, you don't have to be a great Islamic scholar or an expert in Arabic language to know, as I do on Friday afternoons when I'm cleaning my house for Shabbat, that all of a sudden the sermon from the mosque gets blasted onto the loudspeakers, and the imam from the mosque is screaming his sermon, not explaining it nicely like a rabbi would give a sermon in a synagogue. He's screaming a sermon, and when he's yelling about Yahud, Yahud in the middle of his sermon, he's not talking about how peace and tolerance should persevere and how we need to come to reconciliation with our Jewish and our Christian neighbors. No, the issue is that while some people might say that Ramadan is a month of peace, for others who are Islamic fundamentalists, Ramadan is a month of incitement. And I think we've been fortunate that in these 2 years of war since October 7th, that there has not been a massive outright intifada. There's certainly been string of terror attacks. It's been somewhat constant, but we had that also before October 7th. There were definitely great fears here that with October 7th, that with the Israeli offensive into Gaza, that you were going to start to see more and more terror attacks and even rioting coming from the Arab neighborhoods, as we saw in 2021. The last time Israel went into the Gaza Strip, you saw cities like Ramla, Lod, you saw more terror attacks in Jerusalem, more terror attacks in Judea and Samaria. Remember that Hamas is not isolated only to the Gaza Strip. Hamas has terror cells in Judea and Samaria. They have terror cells inside Jerusalem and other areas. And so especially now, if you consider that Israel might go back onto the offensive into the Gaza Strip after a few months of what I'd call relative quiet, even though the situation is not completely over, but it's been relative quiet. If the IDF goes back in, launches a new ground operation, specifically if it takes place during the month of Ramadan, which is going to start this coming week, you might see once again an increase in terror attacks coming from Judea, Samaria, Jerusalem, and elsewhere.
Alex, we're out of time, but let's hope for the best. Let's hope this Ramadan season here is quiet and only good things. And that's all the time we have for this week on Jerusalem Minute. Josh Easton here, correspondent for JNS News, alongside CEO of JNS, Alex Trayman. I want to give a shout out to the people behind the scenes here. Aaron Wogelanter is running the board. Our producers, Zach Sickerman, Esther Eden, station manager Yuri Svretsky, and of course, Ryan Lifshitz. Make sure you go to JNS TV for all the amazing content provided. Give us a super thanks. Go to jns.org for all the latest breaking news from Israel, the Middle East, and the entire Jewish world. Have a great week, everybody.